It was supposed to be an ordinary Thursday, the kind of evening that folds itself around you like a familiar old blanket. Warm and unremarkable, and that ordinariness is what makes the memory jagged. My wife, Emma, had gone out to water the small rectangle of lawn at the front of our house. The hose arcing silver in the late light, her hair caught up in a casual knot, a mug of coffee cooling on the porch table untouched. She hummed something under her breath, the kind of absent, contented sound people make when they feel safe. And for a moment I watched from the living room window, a book in my lap but not really reading. The ordinary hum of the neighborhood settling around us like dusk settling on a map. The streetlights were not yet on, but the sun was surrendering, turning the clouds to bruises of purple and orange. And across the cul-de-sac, the roses on Mr. Delgado's porch leaned like old men toward the last warmth of the day. I remember thinking about nothing in particular: dinner, laundry, a text I'd meant to answer when the sound came. A sudden crack that sliced through the air and made the dog in Mrs. Whitaker's yard begin to bark in a high, confused chorus. It was not the metallic echo of a car backfiring or the distant report of fireworks. It was the metallic, clinical sound of a rifle being discharged. The kind of sound that narrows your world to a single cold point. Time did what it does when aches or shocks hit. It slowed. The book fell from my hands, and the floor met my knees in a motion that felt both instinctive and automatic as it pushed the screen door open and the cool evening rinsed over me. The hose coiled by Emma's feet, its nozzle spitting drops that turned to jewels in the sundown. She was on the porch steps before I reached her. One hand pressed to her midsection, her face white and pinched like porcelain under stress. Blood spread between her fingers, dark and startling against the pale fabric of her blouse. And for a horrible fraction of a second, the scene looked unreal, as if someone had staged it and forgotten to tell us we were actors. Across the street, on the sidewalk by the HOA mailbox, stood Karen, our neighborhood's self-appointed guardian of curb appeal. The woman who chaired meetings with a clip in her voice and a calendar in hand. Her hair, which I had always seen coiffed in exacting waves at our association meetings, clung damp to her temples. Her hands trembled around the stock of a hunting rifle, as if it were both too heavy and suddenly too small. Her mouth was open. She was saying something about violations and boundaries. Words shredded by the escalating noise in my head until they were nothing but fragments. In the distance, a siren began its wail, a long, keening promise of help. But my world contracted inward to the scene on my lawn, Emma, bleeding and bewildered. Karen, pale as paper, a rifle still in her grasp. The hose with its last droplets catching the dying light like tiny, mocking stars. I crouched beside Emma without thinking about training or rules or how to be a husband in a crisis. I simply went where my body had gone 1,000 times, before in 1,000 different uniforms, and I felt her pulse under my fingers. Shallow and jumpy, each beat a tiny hammer in a hollow. My hands, which had steadied rifles on cold mornings and steadied a buddy's head on dusty roads, moved with a tenderness that surprised me. I tried to compress the wound with intuition rather than thought, to be both surgeon and sanctuary. She blinked up at me with eyes that were huge and bright with shock. For a second they took me away from the chaos and back to every small, ordinary day we had ever shared. Coffee mugs with lipstick marks, burnt toast, the way she left tiny notes on the fridge. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking. "I'm okay," she mouthed, though she was not. The words dissolved into a rasp that turned my stomach. There was fear there, bright and sharp as glass. Then something else, a sliver of humor maybe, or disbelief, that flared and then dimmed. I told her she had to hold still, that help was coming, that I had her, and she squeezed my hand as if to anchor herself to me, and in that grip I found the steady, animal certainty that had always lived in me. She was mine, she was here, and I would not let this be the thing that took her, for the fraction of a second that reality allowed. My military life and the suburban life collided in a way that was ugly and inexorable. Every muscle remembered the geometry of cover, the whisper of movement, the calculus of threat. I heard the neighbors shouting, a scattershot of phrases. "Call 911. Don't move her. What did you do?" But the words were like rain on tin compared to the internal metronome that had been set long ago. Breathe, assess, secure. I checked on the rifle's direction, the line of sight from Karen's hands to where Emma lay. Imagining trajectories and obstructions, small merciless maths of ballistics that had been inked into me through training and loss. There are no rehearsals for the things that happen in your life's worst moments, but years of living at the pointed end of decision-making had seeded habits in me: slow breathing, soft attention, a focus so narrow it washed the world in high contrast. I noticed the way Karen's knees had locked. I noticed the way her lips quivered around a single word I could not quite parse. I noticed how, despite the rifle in her hands, her fingers kept slipping as if she could not fully own what she had done. The neighbors' faces were drawn in that peculiar way human faces draw when they have seen something beyond their normal bandwidth for suffering. Mr. Delgado's beard was pinched with confusion. The teenage boy from 2 doors down had gone pale and was clutching his phone as if it could conjure answers. And Mrs. Whitaker's hands were flat against her mouth, the dog whining at her heels. In the periphery of my vision, police-like figures began to coalesce. Not the uniformed responders yet, but people becoming responders in that small, messy way communities do. Someone applying pressure to a towel. Another covering Emma's legs with a blanket. Someone else barking orders into a phone. The siren that had been a long way off now cut through the evening with another level of immediacy, its keening pitch folding into the rhythm of my heart. I told someone, probably the high school kid, to call 911 and to tell them our address and to tell them a woman had been shot. And the words were raw and hard to say aloud, but they had to be said. All the while my mind kept running scenarios. What motivated Karen? Anger? Frustration? A moment of deranged conviction? Had there been earlier encounters I'd missed? A simmering resentment coughed up at an HOA meeting and carried home like an undigested grievance. Why a rifle? And why at that distance? And why at my wife? Those questions swarmed me, but there was no time to answer them. Trauma does not wait for understanding. It insists on the urgent. I remember the look on Karen's face when she realized what the sound she'd said meant. Not the moral recognition, necessarily, but the practical one. That a life lay crumpled on my porch, and that everything beyond that fact was now suspended in consequence. She seemed to shrink where she stood, a woman in a dress and sensible shoes betrayed by the enormity of a single act. Her eyes flicked from Emma to me, and then to the homes around us, as if searching for an exit route, both literal and moral. People shouted at her to put the gun down. Someone, I later learned it was the kid from 2 doors down, edged toward her, not with courage, but with the gravity of someone trying to keep the world from tipping further. In moments like that, you realize how thin the membrane of civility is, how quickly rules and ordinances and the carefully solicited consent of neighbors dissolve when fear and rage stir. I kept my hands on Emma, felt the heat of her skin under my palm, the tremors of pain that made her shoulders hitch. I whispered to her about our daughter. We don't have children. But in that whisper was every promise I had ever meant to keep, about the stupid things we would do when she got better, about being together. My voice felt small and insufficient, like bringing a match to a flood, but it seemed to hold her in some immediate present, to tether her to something familiar rather than let her drift into the dark. The ambulance arrived like an answer to prayer, its lights throwing the cul-de-sac into sudden, harsh blue and red. Paramedics moved with brisk, practiced choreography, asking questions I could barely track, and then not needing answers because they had protocols that fit even this chaos. They praised Emma for being breathing and responsive, words that felt like threadbare hope. As they readied her for transport, the weight of what had happened began to settle around me. Not as an understanding, but as a shape. My front yard had become an incident scene, my wife a patient, and the woman who had pulled the trigger, Karen, a person whom we would later call a perpetrator, a label that felt enormous and impossible all at once. There are things you learn when life hands you a moment that will define a before and after. You learn how quickly neighbors become witnesses, how strangers line up to offer assistance as if answering a bell. You learn to catalog details because memory is slippery when trauma is hot. I catalogued the way the gravel beneath Karen's shoes crunched when she moved. The exact position of the mailbox that might have obscured a shot if it had been 1 foot further to the left. The sound of Emma's breath as the paramedics loaded her into the ambulance, uneven but alive. I catalogued because cataloging is a kind of armor against chaos. A way to take the raw and fold it into something that can be told later without the jagged edges cutting the teller. As the ambulance pulled away and the siren diminished into the distance, the cul-de-sac seemed to exhale. People began to drift back toward their houses, faces lit by the afterglow of adrenaline and the horror of what they had witnessed. And in the silence that followed, I felt a new kind of solitude. The solitude of someone who has watched his life fight for Kate in an instant, who has seen his partner's life reduced to a fragile thing on a stretcher, and who is left to stand at the intersection of before and after. I walked the few steps to the curb where Karen stood, the rifle now secured by an officer's careful hands, and our eyes met. There was no triumph in me, no joy even in her capture. There was only the raw animal requirement to know why. To understand how a woman with clipboards and meeting minutes had decided that a rifle was the language to settle whatever grievance she had. Her face was a map of confusion and fear. In that look, I saw not only culpability, but the terrible, human truth that people can make choices that break other people's worlds in an afternoon. That evening rewired me. The sunset that had been so beautiful earlier now settled over a landscape altered by violence. And the ordinary, the garden hose, the coffee mug, the porch light became the backdrop for a night when everything I had taken for granted was suddenly askew. When the ambulance disappeared down the street, taking Emma with it, the sound of the siren didn't fade. It echoed inside me like a drumbeat. The air around me was suddenly too still, too fragile, as if the entire neighborhood were holding its breath. The flashing lights had gone, but their ghostly red and blue reflections still pulsed in the windows. A visual reminder that something had shattered and would never fit back the same. I stood there in the half-dark, every sense stretched thin. The smell of gunpowder faint but unmistakable in the cooling air. The police were moving around, voices clipped and professional, cordoning off the area, marking evidence, murmuring into radios. I knew the rhythm of their work. I'd done my time on battlefields where every sound mattered, where every breath could reveal a sniper's position. But here, on the quiet street where children rode bikes and sprinklers hissed in summer, it felt obscene to hear that tone of command. I wasn't a Marine right then, not yet, but something inside me was stirring. An old instinct rising from the depths like a tide returning to a scarred shore. Karen was still there. They hadn't arrested her yet, not properly, just disarmed her, sat her on the curb, and started asking questions. Her mouth moved, but I didn't hear what she said. My hearing was fine, but my mind refused to let her voice in. I didn't want words. I wanted to understand the shape of her madness. She had always been ... particular. The kind of woman who measured grass height with a ruler and left. Typed notices about trash can placement. But this was beyond any rule or regulation. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, a misfire, some ghastly accident of ricochet and bad luck. But when I replayed the scene, the stance, the aim, the recoil, I knew better. I'd seen that posture before. It wasn't the flailing chaos of someone startled by a weapon. It was deliberate, controlled. She had fired with intent. When the officers turned their backs for a moment, I found myself stepping closer, just far enough to meet her eyes. They were small, glassy things behind the fog of shock, but they flicked up and found me, and for the first time since it happened. Not the kind born of regret, but the animal kind. The kind that recognizes a predator. I didn't say anything, but I didn't have to. The way I stood, the way I breathed, it was all different now. She didn't know what she had done beyond pulling a trigger. She didn't understand that she had awoken something in me that had long been sleeping. Something precise, unrelenting, and patient. The officers asked me to come down to the station to give my statement, but I told them I would follow after I checked on my wife. I drove behind the ambulance until it vanished into the hospital bay, then parked at the far end of the lot and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Inside, the hospital was a blur of motion and antiseptic smell. Nurses, doctors, clipped questions, blinking monitors. They let me see Emma once she was stabilized. She was pale but breathing on her own, her hand warm under mine. I leaned down and whispered to her, though I wasn't sure she could hear me. "I've got you. You're safe now. I promise." The promise burned like a brand, because I knew what it meant. It wasn't just a husband's vow. It was a Marine's mission statement by the time I left the hospital. Night had folded itself over the town. The streets were silent except for the occasional sweep of a patrol car's headlights. When I turned down our street, I saw the police tape fluttering across my driveway like a banner of warning. The crowd was gone. The chaos had receded into the eerie calm that always follows violence. I should have gone inside, packed a bag, maybe called my commanding officer from the reserves, but I didn't. Instead, I walked across the road to where Karen's house stood, lights off, blinds drawn. A single squad car idled at the curb, an officer inside, maybe guarding the scene, maybe just keeping watch. When I asked him if she was inside, he said she had been taken to the station for questioning, then released pending further investigation. Released. The word rang hollow in my ears. My wife was in a hospital bed, stitched and sedated, and the woman who shot her was home, sleeping in her own bed under the same sky. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I cleaned my hands of the hospital smell, sat on the back porch, and let the stillness soak through me. The stars were bright, cruelly bright, and for a while, I listened to the distant hum of the interstate and the low hoot of an owl from the woods behind the houses. I remembered Fallujah Helmand, the way silence felt before a strike, the way you could sense when a person was out there watching you, waiting. I'd spent years learning to read that silence, to find the unseen through rhythm and stillness. And as I sat there, I realized something I didn't want to admit. Karen wasn't just unstable. She was dangerous. A person who fires a rifle once can fire it again. And I had a duty as a Marine, as a husband, as a man who knew what it meant to stand between danger and the innocent, to make sure she never got that chance. At dawn, I saw her. She was outside her house, pacing near the edge of her property, speaking to someone on her phone. No police now. No witnesses. Just her in the long, empty stretch of morning light. I stayed where I was, in the shadow of the maple tree, unseen. Every detail registered with absolute clarity. Her posture, the tremor in her hand, the way she kept glancing toward my house. It wasn't remorse I saw in her movements, it was agitation. Fear turning into defensiveness. She still didn't understand what she had done, not really. Maybe she thought it was justified, or that the law would protect her from the consequences. But I'd seen that look before too, in men who believed they were still in control of something that was already slipping through their fingers. I moved before I thought about it. The training isn't something you can turn off. My body fell into rhythm, my steps silent, my breath steady. The distance between us closed like the narrowing end of a scope. When she finally turned and saw me, her eyes widened, and for a heartbeat, neither of us spoke. Then she said my name, her voice trembling, almost pleading, as if we were still neighbors, as if the line she had crossed could be erased with a word. "I didn't mean to," she began, but the words caught in her throat. I didn't interrupt her, didn't raise my voice, didn't take another step. I just looked at her, really looked, until she understood that there was nowhere left to run. "I'm not here for revenge," I said finally, my voice low, steady. "But I need you to understand something. You didn't just shoot a woman. You shot a Marine's wife. You shot someone I swore to protect." She tried to speak again, but I continued, each word deliberate, carved from something deeper than anger. "If you ever so much as lift a weapon again, if you threaten another soul, I will be there. I will see you before you see me. And I will make sure you never get the chance to hurt anyone again." Her lips trembled, tears pooling but not falling. She nodded, a tiny broken motion, and for the first time, I saw her as what she was, not a monster, but a coward. A small person who mistook control for power until she met the consequence of both. I turned and walked away before she could speak again. Back home, the sun was rising, spilling gold across the blood-stained porch steps. The paramedics had cleaned most of it, but the faint outline was still there, proof that the world could change in a heartbeat. I stood there for a long time, feeling the warmth of the light, thinking about Emma, thinking about how close I'd come to losing her. The Marine in me had wanted retribution, precision, closure, but the man in me, the husband, understood something else. Sometimes justice isn't a bullet. Sometimes it's the weight of living with what you've done, the knowledge that the world now sees you for what you truly are. Karen moved away 2 weeks later. The house stayed empty for months, the grass growing wild, the for sale sign leaning crooked in the wind. Emma healed, slowly but surely, and we learned to live again, a little quieter, a little warier, but alive. Still, there are nights when I wake up and hear the echo of that rifle crack in my mind. And every time I do, I remind myself, she didn't know who she was dealing with that day. But more importantly, I remind myself that I did, and that knowing made all the difference.